Amaya had always believed that her father was her anchor in the world, the steady presence that could calm storms both outside and within her own heart. From the earliest days she could remember, he had been there, guiding her small hands as she learned to climb trees in their village, teaching her the ways of the land, and telling stories by the fire that painted the night with wonder and possibility. He was not only her father but her mentor, her protector, and the one person whose approval she sought above all others. His voice, firm yet gentle, carried authority and warmth, and when he looked at her, she always felt seen in a way that no one else could offer. Their bond was so profound that it shaped the very rhythm of her life. Every choice she made, every dream she nurtured, seemed to orbit the gravity of his presence. From dawn until dusk, Amaya and her father spent their days in shared pursuits. In the fields they would work side by side, tending to crops, repairing fences, and ensuring the livestock thrived. He taught her the intricacies of planting, the patience required for the earth to yield, and the understanding that every action, however small, could ripple into consequences both good and bad. Yet it was not the physical labor alone that connected them, it was the conversations that flowed between them, effortless and intimate. He encouraged her to question, to explore, and to imagine beyond the boundaries of their village. Her ideas were never dismissed. Instead, they were examined with curiosity and nurtured with wisdom. These moments wove a tapestry of trust, binding them tightly together. Even in matters of the heart, Amaya turned to her father. He guided her gently through the confusion of early emotions, the pangs of first love, and the understanding of compassion and kindness. She learned from him not only how to survive in the world but how to navigate its complexities with integrity. Her father's counsel became her compass, and the knowledge that he would always offer a guiding hand gave her the courage to dream boldly. He spoke of hopes for her future, envisioning paths where she could become a leader, a healer, a voice for justice. Every word strengthened her resolve, and every gesture of support cemented the deep trust she had in him. Their evenings were often spent near the hearth, where the flickering flames mirrored the flickers of their shared ambitions. He would recount tales of ancestors, warriors, and wise leaders, embedding lessons within the stories. He praised her intelligence, her curiosity, and her sense of fairness, reminding her that the values she carried were the true measures of her character. In those moments, Amaya felt the world shrink to a circle of warmth, laughter, and guidance. A world where betrayal seemed unimaginable, and where her father's love was the constant she could rely on. She confided her secrets, her fears, and her desires in him, trusting implicitly that he would understand and protect her from harm. It was a bond that transcended mere family ties. It was a foundation of her very identity. Amaya's dependence on him extended to her daily decisions as well. From choosing the right seeds to plant, to determining how best to mediate disputes among friends or neighbors, she sought his advice, confident that his wisdom would illuminate the path. She admired the way he balanced fairness with pragmatism, kindness with discipline, and strength with gentleness. Watching him navigate the complexities of life, she internalized not only his methods but his philosophy. Each lesson was a seed planted in her mind, and under his guidance, it flourished. She began to see the world through the lens he had taught her, with clarity, patience, and a deep respect for the unseen threads that bound people and nature together. In quieter, more intimate moments, the depth of their connection became even more evident. On moonlit nights, they would sit atop the hills overlooking the village, sharing dreams and confessions. He encouraged her to speak her thoughts freely, and she did so without hesitation, knowing her words would never be judged but treasured. She spoke of the future she imagined, of hopes she dared not voice to anyone else, and he listened, offering wisdom without imposing his own desires upon her. It was in these moments that the true weight of their bond became clear. Trust was not merely given, it was nurtured, tested, and reinforced with care. And Amaya had never felt the need to question it. Yet beneath the warmth and guidance lay a fragile vulnerability, one that Amaya could not see. The depth of her dependence made her open, trusting, and unknowingly exposed. Her father, the very person she idolized and leaned upon, became entwined in her perception of safety and guidance. Every dream she held, every ambition she pursued, seemed tethered to his presence, his approval, and his counsel. She had built her world around him, believing that no force could ever sever the trust between them. Little did she know, the very foundation she relied upon was the one that would soon fracture, and the betrayal that would shatter her heart would strike at the core of everything she had come to believe about love, trust, and family. The bond between Amaya and her father was a tapestry of shared experience, guidance, and unwavering faith. It was the kind of bond that shaped destinies, nurtured courage and fostered resilience. And it was precisely this bond, so pure, so complete, that would make the eventual betrayal feel like a force of nature itself. Sudden, devastating, and impossible to ignore. The emotional weight of their relationship set the stage for the storm that was coming, a storm born not of circumstance but of the deepest wounds inflicted by those we trust most. As Amaya moved through her days, immersed in the comfort of his presence, she could not yet imagine that this trust would be tested, that the very person she had leaned on for strength would become the source of her greatest heartbreak and the catalyst for the vengeance that would rise from her shattered heart. Amaya had always sensed a rare confidence in her father, an aura of certainty that seemed unshakable even in the face of the village's many hardships. He spoke with authority, his voice measured, and every word carried a weight that compelled respect from neighbors and elders alike. Yet, as the days stretched into weeks, subtle inconsistencies began to surface, small, almost imperceptible signs that hinted at a truth Amaya had never dared imagine. At first, she brushed them off, attributing them to mere coincidence or the natural complexity of adult responsibilities. But gradually, the threads of suspicion wove themselves into a picture she could not ignore. It began with the whispered conversations she would overhear late at night, their content half-muffled, the tone urgent and secretive. Her father's voice, usually open and inviting, carried a different cadence now, sharp, careful, and tinged with caution. Amaya, with her naturally observant nature, noted the unfamiliar tension in his gestures and the careful avoidance of certain topics when she approached. She questioned herself, wondering if her imagination was at play, but the unease in her chest refused to dissipate. There was a subtle duplicity, a pattern that hinted at hidden agendas, and her heart began to pulse with a mixture of fear and curiosity. During meals, she noticed that his eyes would sometimes flicker toward letters or messages that arrived unannounced, which he would quickly conceal or hastily place in locked drawers. The locks themselves were new, their presence uncharacteristic for a man who had always encouraged openness. When Amaya attempted to casually inquire about these notes, her father's replies were vague and slightly irritated, dismissing her with an assurance that she need not concern herself with matters beyond her understanding. The dismissal, however, did not soothe her. Instead, it sparked a slow-burning suspicion, planting the first seeds of doubt in her mind. Her father's behavior toward the villagers also began to shift subtly. He would meet with certain influential figures in secrecy, holding private discussions that left Amaya excluded and puzzled. When she asked questions, he would offer benign explanations, citing the need for discretion or the demands of leadership. Yet, the frequency and secrecy of these meetings suggested more than mere administrative matters. Amaya's intuition, honed through years of observing character and intent, whispered that something vital was being concealed. She began to feel the first delicate tremors of a crumbling trust, a trust she had assumed was unassailable. Small inconsistencies in his past decisions added to her unease. A crop agreement he had assured would benefit the entire village had, upon closer examination, favored a select few. Contracts, alliances, and promises that he had presented as fair and equitable were quietly skewed in ways that benefited him, or someone aligned with him, at the expense of others. Amaya, torn between disbelief and the nagging sense of betrayal, found herself replaying conversations in her mind, searching for missed hints, patterns, or clues that could explain this sudden divergence from the man she had idolized. Every detail seemed to create a labyrinth of questions, leading her deeper into a growing sense of uncertainty. The villagers themselves began to act in ways that reflected suspicion, whispering rumors that hinted at clandestine arrangements and questionable loyalties. Although she initially resisted these narratives, the cumulative weight of evidence, her observations, subtle irregularities, and the villagers' quiet murmurs, created a tension that pressed against the walls of her certainty. She could no longer ignore the signs. Her father, whose guidance had shaped her life, was behaving in ways that were contradictory to the values he had instilled in her. Her heart, which had always been buoyed by the trust and warmth of their relationship, began to feel the first sharp pangs of betrayal. Yet even as doubt gnawed at her, Amaya tried to find rational explanations. Perhaps her father was making difficult decisions for the greater good, weighing interests that she could not yet comprehend. Perhaps there were dangers unknown to her, threats that required secrecy and caution. She clung to these possibilities, struggling to reconcile the man she loved and trusted with the one whose actions now seemed shadowed and secretive. Her mind became a battlefield of loyalty and suspicion, of hope and trepidation. As days turned into nights, the subtle signs intensified. Letters that were hastily burned, Meetings held in the dead of night and guarded conversations with strangers created an invisible barrier between father and daughter. The warmth that had once defined their bond began to fray at the edges, replaced by tension and unspoken questions. Amaya found herself watching him, noting the careful measures he took to conceal his activities, and feeling the slow erosion of the certainty she had always relied upon. Every gesture, every shadowed glance, seemed to carry meaning beyond what he would admit. Finally, the cumulative weight of hidden deceptions began to take its toll on her psyche. The man she had trusted implicitly, the anchor of her life, her guide and protector, was no longer fully accessible to her. The invisible walls he had erected left her feeling isolated, a silent observer to the unraveling truth. Though she had not yet confronted him, nor fully uncovered the extent of his betrayal, the foundation of her world had begun to crack. Tension simmered in every interaction, and her heart, once secure in the certainty of his love, now quivered with apprehension and a creeping sense of impending heartbreak. The subtlety of the deception was perhaps what made it most unbearable. There were no dramatic confrontations, no overt acts of malice, only the quiet, relentless accumulation of evidence that whispered a single devastating truth. The man who had shaped her life, who had taught her trust and nurtured her dreams, was capable of betrayal. The tension of not knowing, of suspecting but not yet confronting, created a slow, grinding weight on Amaya's heart. Each day, each interaction, added layers to the storm gathering within her. A storm that would soon demand confrontation, resolution, and ultimately, the reckoning of a trust that had been shattered before her very eyes. Amaya had felt the tremors of doubt for weeks, the uneasy stirrings that whispered of secrets and hidden motives. But nothing could have prepared her for the full revelation of her father's betrayal. It began with a letter, stumbled upon by chance, slipped between pages of a ledger he had left unattended. The paper was heavy with truth, outlining alliances that undermined the village, deals that enriched him at the expense of trust, and plans that directly endangered the people she loved. As she read each word, a cold clarity settled over her. This was no mistake, no lapse in judgment. It was deliberate. Shock hit her first, a visceral, stomach-turning disbelief. The father she had adored, the man whose guidance had been her anchor, was not the hero she had believed him to be. Each sentence of the letter shattered the illusions she had clung to, tearing away the comforting narrative of love and protection she had built around him. Her hands trembled and a hollow ache formed deep within her chest. She could hardly breathe, as though the very air had turned heavy, laden with the weight of the truth she had uncovered. Heartbreak followed swiftly, sharp and unrelenting. The memories of laughter shared, lessons taught, and secrets confided now seemed tainted, cast in shadows of deceit. Every moment spent trusting him was now colored with the knowledge of his duplicity. Her father, the man who had been her guide, her protector, and her closest companion, had orchestrated a web of lies that ensnared not only her but the community that had depended on his guidance. The depth of her sorrow was overwhelming, a river of grief that threatened to drown her in its current. Amaya's mind raced with questions, the most painful of which was why. Why had he done this? Was there ever love beneath the schemes? Had their bond been genuine, or merely a facade to manipulate her trust? The answers were elusive, obscured by layers of deception and self-interest. She recalled the subtle inconsistencies she had noticed in recent weeks, the secret meetings, the guarded glances, the unexplained letters, and felt a bitter sting of regret for not seeing it sooner. The realization that she had been blind, that her trust had been exploited, added another layer of anguish to her already shattered heart. Abandonment followed closely behind heartbreak, a hollow emptiness that settled like frost in her chest. She felt isolated, as though the world she had known had shifted beneath her feet. The man who had once been her safe harbor had become the source of profound loss. Every dream she had shared with him now seemed fragile, tainted by betrayal. The home that had felt secure now appeared cold and unwelcoming, the warmth replaced by the echo of deceit. Amaya realized that she was alone in ways she had never imagined, cut adrift from the person she had relied on most. Yet, beneath the pain and despair, a fire began to ignite. Anger, sharp and consuming, seeped into her consciousness. The betrayal had stripped her of innocence, but it had also awakened something resilient within her. Her mind, though clouded with sorrow, began to assess, to plan, to consider the consequences of this treachery. The emotional turmoil was no longer just grief, it was the first spark of determination, the recognition that while she had been wounded, she was not powerless. In that moment, Amaya's heart was both broken and awakening. The shock, heartbreak, and sense of abandonment coalesced into a storm of raw emotion, threatening to overwhelm her but also propelling her toward clarity. She understood, with a painful certainty, that the man she had trusted most had crossed an irreparable line. The father she had loved and revered was now the architect of her suffering, and from this realization, a new purpose began to take shape. Her heartbreak would not be silent. Her pain would not be passive. From the ruins of trust and love, a storm was beginning to gather within her, one that would demand reckoning, justice, and a reshaping of the world that had betrayed her. Amaya sat alone in the quiet of her room, the weight of betrayal pressing down on her chest like a stone. Every memory of her father, every word of guidance he had offered, felt twisted now, poisoned by the revelation of his deceit. The world she had known, the life she had trusted implicitly, seemed to splinter around her. Each familiar corner of her home, each item imbued with their shared history, became a reminder of what had been lost. Her grief was raw, consuming, and unrelenting, a heavy fog that clung to her mind and body. Anger surged within her like a wildfire. She thought of the letters, the secret dealings, the alliances that endangered not only her but the village itself. How could he? How could the man she had idolized, the one she had leaned on for guidance, weave such treachery into the very fabric of her life? The fury that coursed through her veins was both terrifying and empowering, igniting a fire that burned away the paralysis of sorrow. Her mind replayed every slight, every hidden action she had once overlooked, magnifying them into symbols of profound injustice. Yet grief lingered alongside anger, a twin shadow that refused to release her. She mourned the bond that had been shattered, the trust that had been weaponized against her. Her heart felt brittle, fractured into countless jagged pieces, each one sharp enough to cut her as she moved through the memory of her father's smiles and encouragements. The loneliness was staggering, a stark reminder that the person she had relied on most was no longer a source of safety, guidance, or love. In this void, despair took root, entwining with anger and grief to create a suffocating weight that seemed impossible to lift. Amidst the swirling storm of emotion, a new feeling emerged, a deep, relentless hunger for revenge. It began as a whisper in the corners of her mind, a subtle prompting that she should not remain passive. Her father's betrayal demanded action, a reckoning that could restore balance and assert her power in the face of such cruelty. The desire was not born of mere spite. It was a natural response to the devastation of trust and the violation of everything she had believed sacred. It thrummed through her veins, steady and persistent, sharpening her focus and fueling her resolve. Amaya's grief, anger, and despair merged into a singular clarity. She understood that the world as she had known it was gone, and that to survive, and to make her father understand the magnitude of his betrayal, she would need to embrace the storm within. The rawness of her emotions, heavy and unfiltered, became both a burden and a weapon. In the quiet of that moment she began to chart a path forward, one that would not only confront the betrayal but transform her suffering into a force that could not be ignored. Her shattered heart had given rise to an ember of vengeance, and from it, a storm was beginning to form. Amaya withdrew from the village like a shadow slipping into the forest, her presence fading from the lives of those around her. The betrayal of her father had carved a deep wound into her soul, one that throbbed with pain, anger, and disbelief. She needed space to think, to breathe, to confront the enormity of what had been done. In the quiet seclusion of her small cabin at the edge of the woods, far from prying eyes and whispers, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her shattered trust. The walls of the cabin, modest and bare, seemed to echo her loneliness, amplifying the sense of isolation that had become her constant companion. Days blurred into nights, each one filled with introspection. She would stare out into the darkened forest, watching the wind bend the branches, the shadows dance among the trees, and the moonlight glimmer on the frost-covered earth. In those moments, Amaya's thoughts returned incessantly to her father. His warm smiles, his guiding words, and the realization that all of it had been a careful illusion masking manipulation. She questioned how she could have been so blind, how she could have trusted so completely. The knowledge that the betrayal was deliberate and calculated gnawed at her, sharpening the ache in her chest. Isolation became both a sanctuary and a crucible. Free from the expectations of others, Amaya allowed herself to explore the depths of her feelings without restraint. She let the grief wash over her, acknowledging the tears, the bitterness, and the helplessness that had built within her. But she also examined her anger, tracing its edges to uncover the raw energy it contained. It was a storm waiting to be unleashed, and in her solitude she began to understand the potential it held. The rage, coupled with the sorrow, was a force that could not be ignored, a seed that could grow into something powerful if she cultivated it carefully. Her thoughts wandered to the village and the lives her father had affected through his deceit. The injustice burned within her, fueling a desire not only to reclaim her own dignity but to see the consequences of his betrayal rendered visible. She replayed moments, conversations, and choices, dissecting each with precision, identifying the ways in which she had been misled. With each reflection she gained clarity, seeing patterns of manipulation and strategies that had once seemed opaque. The more she analyzed, the more a plan began to form, not yet concrete, but tangible in the recesses of her mind. Amaya also considered her own limitations and vulnerabilities. She recognized the gaps in her strength, the areas where naivety had allowed deception to take root. She reflected on her reliance on her father's guidance, and the painful lesson that trust, even in those closest to her, could be weaponized. Yet, in acknowledging her powerlessness, she also discovered the spark of agency. While she could not undo the betrayal, she could determine her response. She could choose how to channel her emotions, how to transform her anguish into purpose. The solitude forced her to confront her inner landscape, and in doing so, she began to reclaim control over her own destiny. The nights became a time of intense focus. Amaya would sit by the fire, the flames dancing in her eyes as she plotted, mapped, and imagined possibilities. She rehearsed confrontations in her mind, visualized outcomes, and weighed the consequences of different courses of action. The storm of emotion within her heart, the grief, the anger, the betrayal, no longer felt chaotic. It had a rhythm, a pulse, a direction. She realized that the raw energy she had once feared could be harnessed, tempered, and directed with precision. In this recognition, a subtle transformation occurred. Her heartbreak, though still raw, began to feel less like a cage and more like fuel. Amaya also reflected on the essence of vengeance. It was not merely about inflicting pain or punishment, it was about asserting her presence, reclaiming dignity, and balancing the scales that had been tipped so drastically against her. She questioned what justice truly meant, what would satisfy the ache in her chest without destroying the person she still hoped to be beneath the anger. These reflections were not easy, they forced her to confront her own morality, the temptation to let fury consume her, and the need to maintain clarity in the face of overwhelming emotion. Each thought honed her understanding, sharpening the focus of the storm building inside her. Isolation offered lessons in patience as well. Amaya learned to observe without acting, to listen to the quiet murmurings of the forest, and to find wisdom in stillness. She recognized the parallels between the natural world and her own emotions. Storms could rage, winds could howl, and yet, eventually, clarity and calm would return. In these moments of observation she found guidance, imagining the forces of nature as allies in the reckoning to come. The growing storm within her heart mirrored the wildness outside, a reflection of the turbulence she was learning to command and understand. By the end of her retreat, Amaya had transformed. Her grief and anger were no longer purely destructive. They had been shaped, focused, and tempered by reflection and solitude. The betrayal that had fractured her world had also revealed the depth of her resilience, her capacity for strategic thought, and her ability to harness emotion as power. The storm inside her heart, once chaotic and uncontrolled, had become a force that could be directed toward purpose, toward justice, and toward the reckoning that awaited her father. She emerged from isolation not weakened by betrayal, but forged by it, ready to confront the treachery that had shattered her trust and reshaped the world in the wake of her storm. Amaya stood at the edge of the cliff overlooking the village, the wind whipping through her hair as if urging her to release the torrent within. The heartbreak and betrayal she had endured had transformed into something more potent, a storm of anger, grief, and determination that pulsed through her very being. Every beat of her heart seemed to synchronize with the wind, every breath a signal that the power she had nurtured in solitude was beginning to awaken. The storm inside her was no longer a chaotic tangle of pain, it was a force ready to be shaped, honed, and directed toward purpose. Her first act of harnessing this power was subtle but undeniable. When she stomped her foot on the frozen ground, the soil trembled beneath her, small cracks forming where her fury met the earth. The trees seemed to bend slightly toward her, as if acknowledging the intensity radiating from her being. The wind carried her whispers across the fields, stirring loose leaves and sending them swirling in a dance of anticipation. It was as though nature itself was responding to the energy she had long held captive, answering the call of the storm that had begun to gather in her soul. Amaya's emotions, once a source of helplessness, had transformed into a reservoir of strength. The grief that had weighed her down was now distilled into focus, guiding her thoughts and decisions with precision. Anger, sharp and unrelenting, became a weapon rather than a burden, infusing her every action with intensity. Heartbreak, though still tender and raw, provided clarity, a reminder of the injustice that demanded redress. Each element of her emotional turmoil had been converted into fuel, and the result was a growing power that felt both thrilling and terrifying. As she moved through the forest near her home, Amaya discovered signs of her influence expanding beyond herself. Small animals paused and regarded her with unusual attentiveness, as if sensing the storm within. Streams swelled slightly when her presence lingered near their banks, ripples dancing in patterns that mirrored the rhythm of her pulse. Even the clouds above seemed to gather with purpose, darkening subtly and shifting in response to the intensity she radiated. These were the first tangible signs that the force she carried was no longer confined to her body or mind. It had begun to extend outward, brushing against the world around her, heralding the storm of vengeance that was slowly forming. In quiet moments, Amaya experimented with this emerging power, testing its limits and learning to control it. She would concentrate on her anger, focusing it like a blade, and observe the way the wind responded, the way branches quivered or water rippled. She discovered that the more clarity she brought to her intent, the stronger and more precise the reaction became. It was a delicate balance, a dance between emotion and control, but with each practice she felt herself becoming more attuned to the storm she carried. The villagers remained oblivious to the changes taking root within her, unaware that the girl they had known, the trusting, gentle daughter of a revered man, was being reborn in the crucible of betrayal and solitude. Amaya's growing abilities were a quiet prelude to the reckoning to come, a sign that the storm she had nurtured in secrecy would soon break free with unstoppable force. The whispers of her power traveled only as far as the wind chose to carry them, hinting at the transformation within but revealing nothing of the fury that was steadily consolidating. By the end of the day, as the sun dipped behind the distant mountains, Amaya stood tall, feeling the culmination of her grief, heartbreak, and rage coalescing into strength. The storm within her heart was no longer a mere echo of betrayal, it was alive, breathing, and ready. The seeds of vengeance had taken root, and with each passing moment, the power she had cultivated began to ripple outward, signaling that the reckoning her father had triggered was approaching with inexorable certainty. Nature itself seemed to brace for the storm that was soon to descend, a herald of the fury Amaya had been forging in silence. News of Amaya's transformation began to ripple quietly through the village, carried by whispers and furtive glances. Those who had once regarded her with pity or indifference now noticed the subtle shifts in her presence. The way the wind seemed to respond to her steps, the unspoken authority in her gaze, and the barely contained intensity that radiated from her every movement. Some villagers, particularly those who had quietly admired her courage and resilience, felt an irresistible pull toward her. They were drawn to the aura of power and determination that seemed to surround her, sensing that Amaya was no longer a victim but a force to be reckoned with. These allies emerged cautiously, testing her resolve and offering support in small ways. A blacksmith who had once shared stories of the village's history and struggles with her, brought supplies and weapons, recognizing the storm gathering in her heart. A few young villagers, inspired by her quiet strength, pledged their loyalty, promising to stand by her side. They saw in Amaya not just vengeance, but the promise of justice and restoration. Each act of support reinforced her sense of purpose, providing the human connection she still craved amid the fury she had nurtured. Yet not everyone welcomed her rise. Those aligned with her father, or those who feared the consequences of her growing power, recoiled at the changes they observed. Whispers of dread and speculation spread quickly. Amaya was no longer the innocent daughter they had known. She had become something beyond their understanding, a harbinger of upheaval. Some villagers actively sought to undermine her, attempting to sway her allies or intimidate her through threats and rumors. Their fear was palpable, their resistance fueled by the desire to maintain control and protect the status quo. Amaya watched these reactions with measured calm, learning to discern loyalty from fear, ally from adversary. She understood that the storm she had cultivated was not merely her own, it was intertwined with the hearts and minds of those around her. Allies could amplify her power, lending their strength to her cause, while enemies could threaten to fracture the delicate balance she had established. The duality of support and opposition sharpened her focus, compelling her to plan with precision and anticipate challenges before they arose. Preparation became her daily ritual. She trained relentlessly, honing both her mental acuity and physical endurance. She strategized, considering the strengths and weaknesses of those who had once been her family and those who now stood either with her or against her. Every conversation, every encounter became a test of intent, a way to gauge the shifting dynamics within the village. The tension was almost tangible, a charged atmosphere in which each movement and word carried weight, and where the approach of confrontation seemed inevitable. By the end of this period, Amaya was no longer isolated. The bonds of loyalty, fear, and opposition had shaped a complex web around her, and she understood that her storm would not strike blindly. Every ally reinforced her resolve, every enemy sharpened her strategy, and the growing tension promised that the moment of reckoning was fast approaching. She stood ready, attuned to the currents of loyalty and fear, poised to unleash the force she had cultivated in the crucible of betrayal. Amaya moved silently through the village just before dawn, the mist curling around her feet like hesitant shadows. Her heart, once shattered by betrayal, now pulsed with a storm of controlled fury. Today she would take her first strike, not recklessly but with calculated precision. The betrayal of her father and those who aided him demanded action, and she had spent long weeks preparing for this moment, honing her power and clarifying her intent. Each step she took felt deliberate, a measured beat in the symphony of vengeance she was composing. Her first target was symbolic rather than direct, the storeroom where her father's secret alliances had been orchestrated, a place that held evidence of deception and corruption. As she approached, the air seemed to thrum with energy, the ground responding subtly to the storm she carried within. She focused on the intent of her action, justice, exposure, and a warning, and as her power flowed outward, the locks on the storeroom twisted and snapped, barriers giving way without a sound. The shelves shuddered, papers fluttered like trapped birds, and the secrets her father had hidden were laid bare for anyone who dared to look. The first consequences were immediate. Villagers waking to the commotion discovered the breach and the evidence of treachery, murmurs of shock and fear spreading quickly. Those who had been complicit in her father's schemes felt a chill of unease, sensing that the storm they had ignored or laughed at had begun to take shape. Amaya watched from the shadows, a silent observer of the ripple her action had caused. Even as satisfaction coursed through her, she understood that this was only the beginning, that the path of retribution carried unpredictable outcomes. Unexpectedly, some of her allies hesitated. Though they had pledged loyalty, the tangible demonstration of her power stirred fear alongside respect. Amaya recognized the duality of her position. She wielded strength, but that very strength could alienate those she needed by her side if not tempered with discernment. The realization only sharpened her focus. Power, she knew, was not simply about striking. It was about timing, precision, and the careful calibration of fear and trust. As the day progressed, Amaya took measured steps to consolidate the impact of her first strike. She left subtle signs, whispers in the wind, glimpses of movement in the forests near the village, that hinted at her presence and reminded both allies and enemies that the storm within her was no illusion. Each action reinforced her growing confidence. She had feared her own power at first, worried it might overwhelm her or spiral uncontrollably. Now she sensed mastery beginning to take root, the energy that had once been raw and untamed aligning with her intent. By nightfall, the village was in a state of tension, a palpable awareness of change rippling through the streets. Amaya retreated to a secluded high point, observing the reactions below. The first strike had succeeded not only in exposing deceit but in shifting the balance of power. Her enemies had felt the tremor of her storm. Her allies, though wary, were inspired by her decisiveness. And Amaya herself felt a new sense of clarity. Her heartbreak, rage, and grief had been transformed into a focused, disciplined force. The storm she carried was no longer an internal tempest alone. It had begun to extend its influence outward, shaping the world in accordance with her will. She understood that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, that each action carried consequences both intended and unforeseen. Yet, with this first strike, Amaya had proven to herself that she was no longer powerless, no longer merely the daughter betrayed. She was the storm incarnate, a force that could sweep through the village, exacting justice and reclaiming what had been stolen. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, she welcomed the coming trials, ready to let the storm she had nurtured rage forth. Amaya stood atop the ridge overlooking the village, her eyes blazing with a cold, unyielding fire. The months of betrayal, heartbreak, and isolation had coalesced into a force within her, a storm of raw emotion and disciplined power that thrummed through every nerve. Each heartbeat was a drumbeat of vengeance, each breath a gale carrying the echoes of all the pain she had endured. The time for measured strikes, subtle warnings, and tentative tests was over. Now she would channel the full breadth of her fury and grief into a decisive act that would confront the source of her suffering, her father. The village below lay silent, unaware of the tempest gathering above. Amaya's heart, once fractured, now pulsed with a rhythm of inevitability. Every thought, every memory, every betrayal was distilled into a sharp focus. She remembered the nights she had spent crying alone, the whispered lies she had once believed, and the moments of false guidance that had left her vulnerable. That anguish had been transformed, tempered in the crucible of isolation and reflection, into something far stronger: clarity, purpose, and a terrifyingly potent resolve. She descended into the village under the cover of night, her presence barely disturbing the air around her. The wind seemed to carry her intent, brushing through the streets, stirring loose leaves, and bending the branches of trees in subtle acknowledgement. Even the animals sensed the power radiating from her, retreating into the shadows as if to witness the coming storm. Every step she took reinforced the gravity of the moment. This was not an impulsive act of rage, but a strategic, carefully orchestrated confrontation. Her father was in his hall, confident that the tides of loyalty and power remained in his favor. He did not hear her approach until the doors shuddered under the force of the wind she summoned, nor see the intensity burning in her eyes until she stepped into the flickering candlelight. The room, once a place of comfort and instruction, now felt alien and threatening, filled with the charged energy of her storm. Amaya's voice, when she spoke, was calm yet thunderous, carrying the weight of every betrayal, every broken promise, every moment he had shattered her trust. "You taught me to trust," she said, her words slicing through the stillness like a blade. "And you taught me betrayal." The accusation hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Her father faltered, sensing the power she wielded, and the fury coiled like a spring within her. For a moment, the man who had once seemed untouchable recognized the magnitude of the daughter he had wronged. The balance of authority had shifted. The storm was no longer distant. It was here, embodied, palpable, and unstoppable. Amaya unleashed the force she had nurtured, a surge of energy that rippled outward, shaking the foundations of the hall. The wind howled like a chorus of the wronged, papers and objects tumbling through the air, candles extinguished in a gust of righteous anger. Her emotions, the heartbreak that had once consumed her, the grief that had weighed her down, the rage that had driven her forward, merged seamlessly with her strategic intent, forming a storm that was as precise as it was devastating. She struck not blindly but with the intent to expose, to confront, and to deliver justice. Her father tried to respond, to plead, to manipulate, but every word he uttered was drowned in the storm she commanded. The walls seemed to vibrate with her intensity, mirrors reflecting not just her image but the magnitude of the force she embodied. She revealed his betrayals to the villagers, conjuring images of his schemes, alliances, and manipulations that had been hidden for so long. The room became a theater of revelation. The man who had betrayed his own daughter was now laid bare before all, powerless against the truth and the storm that carried it. The fallout was immediate and overwhelming. Villagers poured into the hall, witnessing the spectacle of her confrontation, and their shock turned to fear, then understanding. Those who had been complicit in her father's schemes were identified, their deceit exposed under the unrelenting gaze of Amaya's storm. The father himself, stripped of authority, credibility, and power, could only watch as the consequences of his actions unfolded, unable to escape the judgment he had sown through betrayal. Amaya's storm did not end in mere spectacle. It reshaped the village's understanding of power, trust, and justice. Her fury, though fierce, was tempered by the clarity she had gained in isolation, ensuring that her vengeance was purposeful, not destructive for its own sake. Each action was deliberate, exposing lies, restoring dignity to those wronged, and reclaiming her rightful place not merely as the daughter betrayed but as a force of reckoning and transformation. When the storm finally subsided, a profound silence settled over the village. The air still hummed with residual energy, and the people could feel the lasting impact of her actions. Amaya stood tall amidst the remnants of the tempest, her storm spent but her resolve unwavering. The betrayal that had once shattered her had been transformed into a force that demanded recognition, respect, and change. She had confronted her father, claimed her power, and reshaped the world around her with the storm of vengeance she had nurtured within her heart.